Sometimes life puts a person exactly where they need to be, not where they want to be. Sometimes the people who laugh at you today are the same people who will salute you tomorrow. And sometimes a single mark on the skin carries a story heavier than any medal pinned on a uniform. This is one of those stories. A story about a woman who was told she did not belong. A woman who was mocked, pushed down, and humiliated in front of everyone. But what nobody knew, what nobody even bothered to ask, was the truth behind the ink on her wrist. And when the highest-ranking officer on that base saw it, everything changed, not just for her, but for every single person standing on that field. Her name was Amara Nichols. She was 24 years old the day she showed up at Fort Whitmore Military Training Base with nothing but a small green bag over her shoulder and a look in her eyes that was hard to read. Some would call it determination. Others would call it pain. The truth was, it was a little bit of both. Amara had not come from a military family. She had not grown up dreaming of wearing a uniform or carrying a rifle. In fact, she had grown up in a small town in southern Georgia, where the biggest dream most girls were allowed to have was to marry well, raise kids, and keep quiet. But Amara was never the kind of girl who kept quiet, not because she was loud, but because she refused to disappear. She had been raised by her grandmother, a woman named Dorothy, who everyone in town simply called Miss Dot. Miss Dot was the kind of woman who could silence a room just by walking into it. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence was enormous. She had raised Amara since she was 3 years old, after Amara's mother passed away from a sudden illness that nobody saw coming and nobody could explain. Amara's father had already been gone by then. He had left when Amara was still a baby, and Miss Dot never wasted a single breath talking about him. All she would say whenever Amara asked was that some men do not know how to stay, and that is not your fault, child. Miss Dot worked 2 jobs for most of her life. She cleaned houses during the day and worked as a cook at a small diner on the highway at night. She never complained. She never asked for help. And she made sure Amara never went without a meal, a clean dress, or a book to read. Education was everything to Miss Dot. She believed that if you could read, you could think. And if you could think, nobody could ever truly hold you down. Amara carried that belief in her bones like it was part of her DNA. Growing up, Amara was a quiet girl. She did well in school, kept to herself, and spent most of her free time sitting on the back porch with Miss Dot, listening to stories about the old days. Miss Dot had a way of telling stories that made everything feel alive. She talked about her own mother, who had worked in cotton fields. She talked about her uncle, who had fought in a war that nobody thanked him for. And she talked about strength. Not the kind of strength that came from muscles or weapons, but the kind that came from getting up every single morning, even when you had every reason not to. Amara listened to those stories and they shaped her. They became the foundation of everything she believed about the world. That you do not give up. That you do not let people break you. That you keep going, no matter what. When Amara was 17, Miss Dot got sick. It started with a cough that would not go away. Then it turned into something worse. The doctors said it was lung cancer. Stage 3. They said treatment was possible, but expensive. Miss Dot had no insurance. She had no savings. She had nothing but a small house with a leaking roof and a granddaughter who was not ready to lose the only person who had ever truly loved her. Amara tried everything. She worked after school at a grocery store, bagging items and stocking shelves. She picked up extra shifts on weekends. She even started selling baked goods at the local market, using Miss Dot's own recipes. But it was never enough. The bills kept piling up. The treatments were brutal. And Miss Dot, strong as she was, started to fade. It was during this time that Amara got the tattoo. She was 18, and Miss Dot had just gone through a particularly bad round of treatment. She had lost most of her hair, and she could barely eat. Amara sat by her bed that night, holding her hand, trying not to cry. Miss Dot looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said something Amara would never forget. She said, "Baby, you carry me. You always have. Do not ever stop carrying me, even when I am gone." The next day, Amara went to a small tattoo shop on the edge of town. She had never gotten a tattoo before and she was nervous. But she knew exactly what she wanted. She asked the artist to ink a small hummingbird on the inside of her left wrist. Beneath it, in delicate cursive letters, were the words, "You carry me." That was it. Simple. Small. But it meant the world to Amara. Miss Dot saw it a few days later. She did not scold Amara. She did not lecture her about putting ink on her body. She just looked at it for a long time, then touched it gently with her fingertips and smiled. That was enough. That smile was enough. Miss Dot passed away 6 months later. It was a Tuesday morning in November. Amara was sitting beside her when it happened. There was no dramatic final moment, no grand last words. Miss Dot simply closed her eyes and did not open them again. And just like that, Amara was alone. The months that followed were the hardest of her life. She was 18, living alone in a house she could not afford, with no family, no real friends, and no idea what to do next. She finished high school because Miss Dot would have wanted that. She graduated with decent grades, but she had no money for college and no clear path forward. She worked at the grocery store full-time, but the pay was barely enough to cover food and electricity. The house was falling apart. The walls had cracks. The plumbing was old. And every night Amara sat on the back porch alone, looking at the sky, wondering if Miss Dot could still see her. One evening, Amara was watching television when a recruitment commercial came on. It was for the United States Army. The commercial showed soldiers running, training, working together. It showed discipline and purpose. And at the end, it said something that stuck with Amara. It said, "Find your strength." She stared at the screen for a long time after the commercial ended. She thought about Miss Dot. She thought about the stories of her great-uncle who had fought in a war. She thought about all the times Miss Dot had told her that strength was not about muscles, but about getting up every morning. The next day, Amara walked into the local army recruitment office. The recruiter was a young man, probably not much older than her. He looked surprised when she walked in. She was thin, quiet, and did not exactly look like the typical person who walked through that door. But he sat down with her and explained everything. The training, the commitment, the opportunities. And the more he talked, the more something woke up inside Amara. She felt it in her chest, a spark, a direction. For the first time since Miss Dot died, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a place in this world where she could belong. She signed up that week. The process took a few months. There were medical exams, paperwork, interviews. But finally, at the age of 24, after years of working dead-end jobs and trying to keep herself together, Amara Nichols arrived at Fort Whitmore for basic training. The base was enormous. It was loud, chaotic, and completely overwhelming. There were hundreds of recruits arriving that day, most of them younger than her. Some were 18, fresh out of high school, full of energy and excitement. Others were in their early 20s, looking for direction or trying to escape something. Amara did not talk to anyone. She kept her head down, found her assigned barracks, and started unpacking her bag. Her bunkmate was a girl named Stacy Weldon. Stacy was 20 years old, tall, athletic, and came from a military family. Her father was a retired colonel. Her brother was already serving overseas. Stacy had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She was loud, confident, and had an opinion about everything. She looked at Amara the way a lion looks at a mouse. Not with cruelty, exactly, but with a sense of superiority that was hard to miss. The first words Stacy ever said to Amara were, "You look lost." Amara did not respond. She just kept unpacking. Stacy shrugged and walked away, already surrounded by a small group of recruits who seemed drawn to her confidence. Amara noticed this but did not let it bother her. She had not come here to make friends. She had come here to survive, to find something solid to stand on, to honor the woman who had raised her. The first few days of training were brutal. Amara had expected it to be hard, but she had not expected it to break her the way it did. The physical demands were intense. Running, push-ups, obstacle courses, drills that started at 4 in the morning and did not end until night. The drill sergeants were relentless. They shouted, they pushed, they tested every limit. And Amara, who had never been an athlete, who had never been particularly strong, struggled. She was slower than most. She could not run as fast. She could not do as many push-ups. She fell behind on the obstacle course more than once. And every time she fell behind, she heard the whispers. The other recruits noticed. They noticed the way she breathed too hard, the way her legs shook during squats, the way she had to stop and rest when everyone else kept going. Stacy was the first to say something openly. One evening, After a particularly exhausting drill, the recruits were sitting in the mess hall eating dinner. Amara was sitting alone at the end of a table, eating quietly. Stacy walked by with her group and stopped. She looked at Amara and said loud enough for everyone around to hear, "I do not know why they let some people in. This is the army, not a charity program." A few people laughed. Amara did not look up. She kept eating, but her hand, the one holding the fork, trembled slightly. She felt the words land like a punch to the stomach. She had heard words like that before. She had been underestimated her entire life, but hearing it here, in this place where she was trying so hard to become something, it hurt differently. The days continued, and so did the mocking. It was not just Stacy. It was others too. A recruit named Davis, a big guy from Texas who thought he was better than everyone. A girl named Reyes who always seemed to find something wrong with how Amara did things. They did not physically hurt her, but the words, the looks, the exclusion. It was a kind of pain that did not leave bruises but left scars all the same. Amara kept going. Every morning she got up before everyone else. She stretched. She ran in place. She did extra push-ups when no one was watching. She was not naturally gifted, but she was relentless. She remembered Miss Dot. She remembered the words inked on her wrist, "You carry me." And so she carried it all. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the loneliness. She carried it because giving up was never an option. About 2 weeks into basic training, there was a particularly harsh drill. It was an outdoor exercise in full gear under the blazing sun. The temperature was over 90 degrees. The recruits were running a 5-mile course with heavy packs on their backs. Amara was near the back of the group. As usual, her legs burned. Her shoulders ached from the weight of the pack. Sweat poured down her face and into her eyes. She could barely see the person in front of her. Halfway through the course, she stumbled. Her boot caught a rock, and she went down hard. Her knee hit the ground first, then her hands. The pack on her back shifted and almost pulled her sideways. For a moment, she just lay there, face down in the dirt, breathing hard. She could hear the footsteps of others passing by. Some slowed down. Most did not. Then she heard Stacy's voice from somewhere ahead. "Leave her. She is not going to make it anyway." Something inside Amara shifted in that moment. It was not anger. It was not even determination. It was something deeper, something that came from a place she did not fully understand. She pushed herself up slowly. Her knee was bleeding. Her hands were scraped, but she stood. She adjusted the pack on her back, and she started running again. She did not finish first. She did not finish anywhere near the top. But she finished, and when she crossed that line, the drill sergeant, a hard-faced man named Sergeant Pierce, looked at her without expression. He did not say, "Good job." He did not say anything encouraging. He just gave her a slight nod, and for Amara, that nod meant more than any compliment ever could. That night, she sat on her bunk and looked at the tattoo on her wrist, the hummingbird. The words, she whispered to herself, almost like a prayer. "I am carrying you, Grandma. I am still carrying you." What Amara did not know, what none of the recruits knew, was that something big was about to happen. Something that would change everything. Someone important was coming to the base. Someone whose arrival would turn the entire dynamic upside down. A general was scheduled to visit Fort Whitmore the following week. Not just any general, Major General David Harlan. He was a legend in the military world. A decorated officer with over 30 years of service. He had served in 3 combat zones, had received the Silver Star, and was known for being one of the toughest, most respected leaders in the entire armed forces. His visits to training bases were rare, and when they happened, everything had to be perfect. The drill sergeants were on edge. The recruits were told to clean everything, sharpen everything, and perform at their absolute best. No mistakes, no excuses. The base buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone wanted to impress the general. Everyone wanted to be seen. Stacy was especially excited. She saw this as her moment. She had been the top performer in most drills. She was fast, strong, and disciplined. She told everyone who would listen that her father had once served under General Harlan and that this was basically destiny. She talked about it constantly, as if the general was coming specifically to see her. Amara said nothing. She just kept training. She kept her head down. She kept pushing. She did not care about impressing a general. She cared about surviving, about proving to herself that she could do this. that Miss Dot's belief in her was not wasted. The day of the general's visit arrived, and from the moment the sun came up, the entire base was on high alert. Everything was polished, every uniform was pressed, every boot was shined. The recruits stood in formation on the main field, perfectly still, waiting. And then, in the distance, a black vehicle appeared. General Harlan had arrived. The black SUV rolled slowly through the front gate of Fort Whitmore, and the entire atmosphere of the base shifted. It was as if the air itself became heavier. Every recruit standing in formation on the main field straightened their spine a little more, sucked in their stomach a little tighter, and stared straight ahead with an intensity they had never shown before. This was not just another training day. This was the day that could define their entire military career before it even truly started. Major General David Harlan stepped out of the vehicle with the kind of calm authority that only decades of service can create. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair cut short and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His uniform was immaculate. Every medal, every pin, every crease was in its exact place. His posture was perfect. His jaw was set. His eyes, dark and sharp, moved slowly across the field like a searchlight scanning every face, every stance, every detail. Behind him were two aides, both officers, both silent. They walked a step behind him, carrying tablets and folders, but it was clear that General Harlan did not need anything written down. This was a man who saw everything and forgot nothing. Sergeant Pierce and the other drill instructors stood at the edge of the formation, their own postures rigid with respect. Pierce, who normally looked like the most intimidating person on any field, suddenly seemed smaller in the presence of the general. He saluted sharply as General Harlan approached, and the general returned it with a slight nod, barely breaking his stride. The inspection began immediately. General Harlan walked along the rows of recruits slowly, methodically. He did not rush. He did not skip anyone. He stopped in front of each recruit, looked them up and down, checked their uniform, their boots, their posture, their eyes. Some recruits he passed without a word. Others he asked a question. Simple things. Where are you from? Why did you enlist? What is your weapon qualification score? His voice was low, even, and impossible to read. There was no warmth in it, but there was no cruelty either. It was the voice of a man who had seen everything and was simply looking for something worth his attention. Stacy Weldon was standing near the front of the formation, exactly where she had positioned herself on purpose. When General Harlan reached her, she stood taller than ever. Her uniform was flawless. Her boots were like mirrors. She looked every bit the perfect recruit. The general stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment. He asked her name. She answered crisply. He asked her where she was from. She told him. Then she added, almost too eagerly, that her father was Colonel James Weldon, retired, who had served under the general's command in the early 2000s. General Harlan's expression did not change. He looked at her for another moment, then said simply, I remember your father. He was a good officer. Then he moved on. Stacy exhaled, and a small, satisfied smile crossed her face. She had made her impression. She was sure of it. The other recruits near her exchanged glances, some impressed, some envious. This was exactly the kind of moment Stacy had been waiting for. She felt like the general had acknowledged her, like she had been seen. Meanwhile, Amara stood somewhere in the middle of the formation, surrounded by other recruits, who mostly towered over her. She was not in the front. She had not tried to position herself anywhere strategic. She was simply standing where she had been assigned, doing what she had been told to do. Her uniform was clean, but not exceptional. Her boots were polished, but not gleaming like Stacy's. She was not trying to be noticed. She was trying to survive the moment without her knees shaking. Her heart was beating fast. She had never been in the presence of someone this important before. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of expectations, the silent pressure to be perfect. She kept her eyes forward, her hands at her sides, and her breathing steady. She thought of Miss Dot. She thought of the porch back in Georgia. She thought of all the mornings she had woken up and not wanted to get out of bed, but did anyway. That was what this moment required. Just showing up, just standing still, just being there. General Harlan continued his slow walk through the rows. He had passed about 40 recruits by now, most of them blurred together in a sea of green uniforms and nervous faces. He had done hundreds of these inspections over his career. He knew what he was looking for, and he rarely found it in the first few rows. The recruits who stood at the front were usually the ones who wanted to be seen. That did not impress him. What impressed him was something else entirely, something harder to define, something that could not be faked or practiced. He reached the middle of the formation and began walking down Amara's row. She could hear his boots on the ground, each step deliberate and measured. She could feel him getting closer. Her pulse quickened. She tightened her jaw and kept her eyes locked straight ahead. Do not move. Do not shake. Do not give them a reason to notice you for the wrong reason. That was what she told herself. General Harlan stopped in front of the recruit next to Amara. He asked a question. The recruit answered. The general moved on. And then he was standing directly in front of her. Amara felt his presence before she even saw him in her peripheral vision. He was tall and up close. The sheer authority he carried was almost physical. She could feel it pressing against her like a wall. She kept her eyes forward, focused on a point somewhere beyond his shoulder, and waited. The general looked at her. He scanned her uniform, her posture, her boots. Then his eyes moved to her face. She was not the strongest-looking recruit. She was not the tallest. She did not have the sharp, polished appearance of someone like Stacy. But there was something in her face, in the set of her jaw, in the steadiness of her gaze that made him pause. He was about to move on. He had already taken a half step to the side when something caught his eye. It was a small detail, barely visible. The sleeve of Amara's left arm had shifted slightly, perhaps from the wind, perhaps from the way she was holding her hand at her side. And there, just peeking out from beneath the cuff of her uniform, was the edge of a tattoo. General Harlan stopped. He turned back to face her fully. His eyes dropped to her wrist. The movement was slight, but Amara noticed it. She felt a wave of panic rise through her chest. Tattoos were not strictly prohibited in the military, but they were regulated. And more than that, she knew how they were perceived, especially on someone like her, someone who already did not fit in, someone who was already seen as the weakest link. A tattoo was just one more reason for people to judge her, to question whether she belonged. The general did not say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at her wrist. The silence stretched out like a rubber band being pulled to its limit. Amara could feel every pair of eyes in her row turning toward her. She could feel the attention shifting, the curiosity building. Something was happening, and everyone wanted to know what it was. Then General Harlan spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which was a stark contrast to the commanding tone he had used with everyone else. He said, "Recruit, show me your wrist." Amara's heart dropped into her stomach. For a moment she did not move. She could not move. Her body had locked up. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step would send her falling into an abyss she could not climb out of. "Show me your wrist." The words echoed in her head like a drum. Then, slowly, she moved. She lifted her left arm and turned her wrist upward, pulling the sleeve back just enough to reveal the tattoo. There it was. The small hummingbird, its wings spread in mid-flight, delicate and beautiful against her skin. And beneath it, in cursive letters that were slightly faded from years of sun and sweat, the words, "You carry me." General Harlan stared at the tattoo. He did not blink. He did not move. He just stared. The silence on the field was absolute. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sergeant Pierce, standing at the edge of the formation, watched with narrowed eyes, unsure of what was happening. Stacy, who had a clear view from her position near the front, craned her neck slightly to see what was going on. She saw the general standing in front of Amara, looking at her wrist, and a smirk crossed her face. She leaned slightly toward the recruit next to her and whispered, "I told you she does not belong here. She is about to get sent home." But Stacy was wrong. She was very, very wrong. General Harlan's expression, which had been unreadable throughout the entire inspection, changed. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it entirely. But Amara, who was standing right in front of him, saw it clearly. His jaw tightened. His eyes, those hard, dark, unyielding eyes, softened. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to make Amara realize that something was happening that she did not understand. The general reached up with his right hand and slowly unbuttoned the cuff of his own left sleeve. He rolled it back just a few inches, exposing the inside of his own wrist. And there, on the skin of a major general of the United States Army, was a tattoo. It was a hummingbird. Not identical to Amara's, but unmistakably similar. The same bird, the same delicate wings, the same position, mid-flight, as if frozen in a moment of grace. And beneath it, in small, faded letters, were words. Amara could not read them at first. Her vision had blurred because her eyes had filled with tears. She was desperately trying to hold back. She blinked hard and looked again. The words said, "She carries me." The field was silent. Completely, utterly silent. Nobody understood what they were witnessing. The other recruits stared. The drill sergeant stared. Even the general's aide, standing several paces behind, exchanged confused glances. What was happening? General Harlan looked at Amara, and for the first time that day, for perhaps the first time in years in front of a formation of recruits, his voice carried something other than authority. It carried emotion. He asked, "Who gave you this?" Amara swallowed hard. Her throat felt like it was closing. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She tried again. The words came out barely above a whisper. "My grandmother, sir. She raised me. She passed away when I was 18. The general nodded slowly. He did not look away from her. He did not look at anyone else. It was as if, in that moment, the entire field had disappeared, and it was just the two of them standing there, connected by something that nobody else could see or understand. He asked, "What was her name?" "Dorothy Nichols, sir. Everyone called her Miss Dot." Something flickered across the general's face. Something deep and old and painful. He closed his eyes for just a moment, no more than a second, and when he opened them again, they were different. The hardness was still there, but underneath it, there was something raw. He said, "I knew a Dorothy once, a long time ago, before any of this, before the uniform, before the rank. She was the strongest woman I ever met." Amara's legs nearly gave out. She locked her knees to stay upright. Her mind was racing, trying to process what she was hearing. She did not understand. She could not understand. Not yet. The pieces were there, floating in front of her like fragments of a shattered mirror, but she could not yet see how they fit together. The general looked at the tattoo on his own wrist again, then back at Amara's. He said softly, almost to himself, the hummingbird was her favorite. She said it was the only bird brave enough to fly backward, that it was not afraid to go back to where it came from. Amara felt a tear slide down her cheek. She could not stop it. She did not even try. She remembered Miss Dot saying those exact words, sitting on the porch, pointing at a hummingbird hovering near the feeder she had hung from the railing. "That little bird is braver than all of us, baby. It is the only one not afraid to go backward. Remember that. Sometimes going back is the bravest thing you can do." General Harlan straightened up. He buttoned his sleeve back down. He took a breath. And then he did something that nobody on that field expected. Something that would be talked about for years to come at Fort Whitmore. Something that would become legend. He took one step back from Amara and saluted her. A major general of the United States Army saluted a recruit. A trainee. A woman who had been mocked and dismissed and overlooked from the moment she arrived. The lowest-ranking person on that field received a salute from the highest-ranking person on that field. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Stacy's smirk had vanished completely, replaced by an expression of pure shock. Sergeant Pierce's mouth had fallen open slightly before he caught himself and snapped it shut. The other recruits stood frozen, their eyes wide, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Amara did not know what to do. Her training told her to return the salute, but her body was trembling. Her hand shook as she raised it to her temple. She held the salute for as long as the general held his, which felt like an eternity. Then he lowered his hand and nodded at her once, a single, slow nod. Then he turned and walked away. He continued down the row as if nothing had happened. He resumed his inspection, his face once again unreadable, his voice once again even and controlled. But something had changed in the air. Everyone felt it. Something had shifted on that field that could not be unshifted. After the inspection ended, the recruits were dismissed. They scattered in every direction, most of them buzzing with questions and theories about what had just happened. What was the tattoo? Why did the general salute her? Who was she? The gossip spread through the barracks like wildfire. Stories were already being exaggerated and invented. Some people said the general had cried. Others said Amara was secretly his daughter. Others said it was some kind of test, a setup to see how the recruits would react. Amara did not participate in any of these conversations. She went straight to her bunk, sat down, and stared at the wall. Her mind was a storm. She could not organize her thoughts. She kept replaying the moment, over and over. The general's face when he saw her tattoo, the hummingbird on his wrist, the words. "She carries me." The way he said he knew a Dorothy once. The way his voice changed when he said it. Who was this man? How did he know Miss Dot? What was their connection? And why, after all these years, did he carry a hummingbird on his wrist with those words? Amara pulled out a small notebook she kept in her footlocker. It was old, the edges worn, the pages yellowed. It had belonged to Miss Dot. Amara had found it in a drawer after her grandmother passed away. She had never been able to bring herself to read it fully. She had opened it a few times, flipped through pages of Miss Dot's careful handwriting, but the grief was always too sharp, too fresh, and she would close it again. Now, sitting on her bunk with her heart still pounding, she opened the notebook. She turned the pages slowly, reading bits and pieces, grocery lists, prayers, notes about the garden, and then, near the back, she found something she had never noticed before. A letter, not sent, not finished, written in Miss Dot's handwriting but different from her usual style. The handwriting was shakier, as if she had written it when her hands were not steady, perhaps during her illness, perhaps near the end. The letter began with 2 words, "Dear David." Amara's blood ran cold. She kept reading, her eyes scanning the words faster than her brain could process them. The letter was only half a page long, unfinished, but what it contained was enough to crack open a door that Amara never knew existed. Miss Dot had written about a young man she had known decades ago, a boy from the next town over who used to come by her mother's house to help with chores. A boy who was kind, who was gentle, who loved hummingbirds because his own mother had loved them before she passed. A boy who joined the military at 18 and never came back, not because he died, but because he chose a different life. A life that took him far away from the small towns and the cotton fields and the people he had once known. Miss Dot wrote that she never blamed him, that she understood, that the world he entered was bigger than the world they had shared. But she missed him. She missed the boy who used to sit on her porch and watch the hummingbirds. She missed the boy who once told her that she was the strongest person he had ever met. The letter ended mid-sentence. Miss Dot had never finished it. She had never sent it. She had simply tucked it into the back of her notebook and left it there, like a secret she was not ready to share. Amara closed the notebook. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were wet. She understood now. She did not have all the details, not yet, but she understood enough. The General, David Harlan, had known her grandmother. Not just known her, he had loved her. In some way, at some time, in some version of their lives that existed before uniforms and ranks and wars, they had meant something to each other. And the tattoo on his wrist, the hummingbird with the words, "She carries me," was his way of keeping her close. Just as Amara's tattoo, "You carry me," was hers. 2 tattoos. 2 people. 1 connection that had survived decades, distance, death, and silence. Amara lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She did not cry. She had done enough crying for one day. Instead, she felt something new settling inside her, something she had not felt since Miss Dot was alive. She felt seen, not by the other recruits, not by Stacy or Davis or Reyes or any of the people who had mocked her, but by someone who understood exactly what she carried and why. Someone who carried his own version of the same weight. Tomorrow would bring more training, more drills, more challenges. The mockery might continue. The doubt might linger, but something fundamental had changed. Amara was no longer just a struggling recruit trying to survive. She was a woman connected to something larger than herself, something that even a major general could not outrank. And somewhere, she was sure, Miss Dot was watching, smiling that quiet, steady smile, and whispering, "I told you, baby, you carry me. You always have." But the story was far from over. What happened next, in the days and weeks that followed General Harlan's visit, would test Amara in ways she never saw coming. Because being seen by someone at the top does not protect you from the people standing right beside you. And Stacy Weldon, who had watched the general salute the woman she considered the weakest among them, was not going to let that moment go unanswered. The days that followed the general's visit should have been easier for Amara. They were not. In fact, they became harder in ways she had not anticipated. The moment General Harlan saluted her on that field, something shifted in the dynamics of the barracks, and not in her favor. She had expected the mockery to stop, or at least quiet down. Instead, it evolved into something uglier, something sharper, something that came not just from ignorance but from jealousy, resentment, and wounded pride. Stacy Weldon was at the center of it. She had watched the general, the man her own father had served under, walk past her with barely a glance and then stop cold in front of Amara Nichols, the woman Stacy considered the weakest, the slowest, the most undeserving recruit in the entire company. She had watched the general reveal his own tattoo, watched him salute Amara like she was someone important, and it had burned. It had burned deep. Stacy did not confront Amara directly at first. She was too smart for that. She knew that making a scene right after the general's visit would draw attention and possibly get her in trouble. So instead, she began a quiet campaign. She whispered. She planted seeds. She turned conversations in the mess hall into subtle attacks. She told people that Amara must have known the general beforehand, that the whole thing was staged, that it was unfair that someone who could barely pass a basic fitness test was getting special treatment from the highest-ranking officer on the base. The worst part was that some people believed it, not everyone, but enough. There was a group of recruits who had been on the fence about Amara, who had not really participated in the earlier mockery, but had not defended her either. Now, with Stacy feeding them a story that felt easier to believe than the truth, they shifted. They moved further away from Amara. They stopped holding doors. They stopped making room at the table. They stopped seeing her as a fellow recruit and started seeing her as a problem. Amara noticed. Of course she noticed. She was not the kind of person who missed the small shifts in the way people treated her. She had spent her entire life reading rooms, sensing danger, knowing when she was welcome and when she was not. But she did not let it stop her. She could not afford to let it stop her. She was here for something bigger than their approval. Training continued with relentless intensity. The weeks after the general's visit brought a new phase of the program. The physical demands were still there, still brutal, but now they were joined by tactical exercises, team drills, leadership evaluations, and simulations. The drill instructors were no longer just testing who could run the fastest or do the most push-ups. They were testing who could think under pressure, who could lead, who could function as part of a team when everything was falling apart. This was where things changed for Amara. She had always struggled with the raw physical benchmarks. She was not the fastest runner. She was not the strongest lifter. But when it came to strategy, problem-solving and staying calm in chaos, she was different. She was exceptional. The first time anyone truly noticed was during a night navigation exercise. The recruits were divided into squads of 8 and dropped into a wooded area with a map, a compass, and a set of coordinates they needed to reach within 3 hours. No flashlights, no GPS. Just the tools in their hands and whatever skills they had between them. Amara's squad included Davis, the big recruit from Texas who had mocked her before, and 2 other recruits who were openly allied with Stacy. The tension in the group was immediate. Nobody wanted to listen to Amara. Nobody wanted her to lead. Davis took charge right away, grabbing the map and barking directions as if he had done this 100 times. He had not. Within 40 minutes, the squad was lost. Davis had misread the terrain, confused 2 landmarks, and led them in a wide circle that brought them back to a point they had already passed. The squad was frustrated, exhausted, and starting to argue. Some wanted to go east, others wanted to go north. Nobody agreed on anything. Time was running out. Amara had been silent the entire time. She had been watching, listening, observing. She had studied the map before Davis took it. She had noted the position of the stars. She had paid attention to the slope of the ground, the sound of water in the distance, the direction of the wind. These were not things she had learned in training. These were things Miss Dot had taught her. Growing up in rural Georgia, Miss Dot had often taken young Amara on walks through the woods behind their house. She had shown her how to read the land, how to find direction by the moss on trees, how to listen to the world around her instead of just looking at it. Those lessons, absorbed quietly over years of porch conversations and forest walks, were now proving more valuable than any textbook. When the squad was at its most chaotic, Amara spoke up. Her voice was not loud. It was not commanding in the way Davis's was, but it was clear and steady. She said, "We passed a creek about 10 minutes ago. It was running southeast. If we follow it downstream for about half a mile, we will hit the ridgeline that crosses our target coordinates. From there, it is a straight shot north. Everyone turned to look at her. Davis scoffed. He said something dismissive about how she did not know what she was talking about. But one of the other recruits, a quiet guy named Marshall who had not taken sides in the barracks drama, looked at the map, then looked at Amara, and said, "She might be right." There was a pause. The clock was ticking. They had less than 90 minutes left. Davis looked like he wanted to argue, but the failure of his own plan was hard to deny. Reluctantly, the squad followed Amara's suggestion. They found the creek. They followed it. They hit the ridgeline exactly where she said they would, and they reached the target coordinates with 22 minutes to spare. They were the second squad to arrive. Without Amara's intervention, they would not have arrived at all. Sergeant Pierce was waiting at the checkpoint. He marked their time and looked at the group. Then he asked, "Who led the final navigation?" There was a silence. Davis opened his mouth, and for a horrible moment, Amara thought he was going to take credit. But Marshall spoke first. He said, "Nichols did." She figured out the route. Pierce looked at Amara. That same unreadable expression. That same slight nod. He wrote something on his clipboard and moved on. That night, back in the barracks, something small but significant happened. Marshall came to Amara's bunk and sat down on the one across from her. He did not say much. He just said, "Good work tonight." Amara looked at him, surprised. It was the first genuinely kind thing a fellow recruit had said to her in weeks. She said thank you, and he nodded and walked away. It was not a friendship yet, but it was a crack in the wall. The tactical exercises continued over the following days, and Amara kept performing. She was not flashy. She did not seek attention, but her instincts, her ability to read situations, her calm under pressure, all of it stood out to the instructors in ways that raw physical performance could not replicate. She was solving problems that others could not see. She was making decisions that others were too panicked to make, and slowly, very slowly, the people around her started to notice, but Stacy noticed too, and it made everything worse. One afternoon, about a week after the navigation exercise, the company was gathered for a team-based obstacle course competition. It was intense, 12-foot walls, rope climbs, mud pits, tire runs, barbed wire crawls. The squads were pitted against each other, and the times were recorded. The fastest squad would earn recognition from the commanding officers. Amara's squad was assembled randomly by the drill instructors, and by fate or by cruelty, Stacy Weldon was placed on the same squad. The tension was immediate. Stacy looked at Amara with barely concealed contempt. She did not say anything, but her body language said everything. She positioned herself at the front of the group, took charge of the planning, and assigned roles to everyone. Amara was given the worst position, the anchor, the last person through every obstacle, responsible for making sure no one was left behind, but also the one who would receive the least help. The course began. The squad moved fast. Stacy led from the front, and she was good. Her athleticism was undeniable. She scaled the wall first, powered through the rope climb, and sprinted through the tire run without slowing down. The squad was doing well. They were on pace to beat the current best time. Then they hit the final obstacle, a 20-foot cargo net climb, followed by a 10-foot drop into a sandpit. The net was wet from an earlier rain, and the ropes were slippery. The recruits ahead of Amara climbed it with varying degrees of difficulty. Some were fast. Some struggled. Stacy was near the top already, moving with practiced ease. Amara reached the base of the net and started climbing. Her arms were tired. Her grip was weak. The wet rope slipped through her fingers, and she had to adjust her hold every few inches. She was slow. Painfully slow. She could hear the clock ticking in her head. She could feel the eyes of the instructors watching. She could feel the frustration of her squad. Halfway up, her foot slipped. She lost her grip with one hand and swung sideways, hanging by one arm and one leg. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to fall. Her muscles screamed. Her hand burned from the rope. She looked up and saw Stacy at the top looking down at her. Stacy's face was cold. She did not reach down. She did not offer a word of encouragement. She just stared for a moment, then turned and dropped over the other side to the sandpit below. Amara hung there, alone, halfway up a cargo net with nothing but air beneath her and a choice in front of her: let go and fall, ending the course, the competition, and probably everything she had been working for, or hold on and climb. She held on. She swung her free hand back to the rope. She planted her foot, and inch by inch, grip by grip, she climbed. It took her longer than anyone else. The squad's time was hurt because of it. But she reached the top. She pulled herself over, and she dropped into the sandpit on the other side. When she landed, her legs buckled and she went to her knees. Sand caked her face and her uniform. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the rope. But she stood up. She always stood up. The squad's time was not the best. They finished 4th out of 8 squads. Stacy was furious. As they walked back to the staging area, she turned to Amara and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You cost us that. You always hold everyone back. I do not care who salutes you. You do not deserve to be here." The words hit hard, harder than they should have, because part of Amara, a small, tired, bruised part, wondered if Stacy was right. She had been the slowest. She had struggled on the net. She had hurt the team's time. Maybe she did not belong. Maybe Miss Dot's belief in her had been love-talking, not truth. But then something happened that Amara did not expect. Arshel stepped forward. He was not a loud person. He was not a leader in the traditional sense. But he stepped between Stacy and Amara and said, in a voice that was steady and firm, "She finished. That is more than I can say for the people who give up. And she has been the reason we have passed 2 tactical evaluations this week. So maybe think about that before you open your mouth." The silence that followed was sharp. Stacy glared at Marshall, then at Amara, then walked away without another word. A few other recruits shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a girl named Torres, who had been neutral throughout most of the training, looked at Amara and gave her a small nod. Not much, but enough. That evening, Amara sat alone behind the barracks. It was the spot she had claimed as her own quiet space over the weeks. A patch of grass behind the building where nobody went. She sat with her back against the wall and looked at the sky. The stars were bright. The air was cool. Her hands were bandaged from the rope burns. Her body ached everywhere. But she was still here. She was still standing. She thought about Miss Dot. She thought about the notebook with the unfinished letter. She thought about the general and his hummingbird tattoo and the words, "She carries me." She thought about all the ways love leaves its mark on people, sometimes in ink, sometimes in scars, sometimes in the quiet space between 2 people who never got to say goodbye. 3 days later, something unexpected arrived. A letter, hand-delivered by one of the base administrators, addressed to recruit Amara Nichols. She opened it in her bunk, her heart racing. The letter was typed on official military stationery, but at the bottom there was a handwritten note. The handwriting was precise, disciplined, but there was a softness to it that the typed words above did not carry. The typed portion informed Amara that she had been selected for the base's leadership development track, a special program for recruits who showed exceptional tactical ability and leadership potential. It was a recognition that very few recruits received during basic training, and it came with additional responsibilities, additional training, and a significant boost to her military record. The handwritten note at the bottom was brief. It said, "Your grandmother would be proud. She always believed that strength was not about how fast you could run, but about how long you could keep going. Keep going." It was signed D.H. Amara read the note 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it inside Miss Dot's notebook, right next to the unfinished letter that began with, "Dear David." The weeks that followed were transformative. The leadership track pushed Amara in new ways that played to her strengths rather than exposing her weaknesses. She was given scenarios to solve, teams to lead, problems that required thinking, not just endurance. And she excelled, not just adequately. She excelled in a way that made the instructors take serious notice. Sergeant Pierce, who had never given Amara more than a nod, pulled her aside one afternoon and said something she never expected to hear. He said, "Nichols, I've been doing this for 15 years. I have seen a lot of recruits come through here. Most of them have strong bodies and weak minds. You have both. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." Amara did not cry. She had trained herself not to cry in front of anyone at the base. But she felt the words land deep inside her, in a place that had been empty for a long time. The relationship with the other recruits began to shift as well. It was slow. It was not dramatic. But it was real. Marshall became something close to a friend. Torres started sitting with Amara at meals. A recruit named Jackson, who was big and quiet and had never spoken to her before, started checking in on her during physical training. Not in a pitying way, in a respectful way. He would jog alongside her during runs and match her pace, not pushing her to go faster, but just being there. Stacy remained distant and cold, but her influence was fading. The narrative she had tried to build, that Amara was undeserving, that she was getting special treatment, that she did not belong, could not survive the evidence of Amara's performance. When someone consistently shows up, consistently leads, consistently solves problems that others cannot, the gossip loses its power. It becomes noise, and eventually, even noise fades. The final week of basic training arrived with a culminating field exercise that lasted 72 hours straight. It was the ultimate test. Everything the recruits had learned was put into play. Navigation, tactics, teamwork, physical endurance, leadership under pressure. The squads were deployed into a simulated combat environment and evaluated on every possible metric. Amara's squad was given one of the hardest assignments. They were tasked with reaching a fortified position held by an opposing force, gathering intelligence, and extracting without being detected. It was a mission that required patience, precision, and coordination. One mistake could compromise the entire operation. Amara was not the squad leader. That role was given to a recruit named Briggs, who was competent but nervous. Within the first few hours, the pressure got to him. He started second-guessing decisions, hesitating at critical moments, and the squad was falling behind. The other members looked at each other with growing anxiety. They were running out of time. Amara did not take over. That was not her style. Instead, she moved closer to Briggs and spoke to him quietly. She did not undermine him. She did not criticize him. She simply offered observations. She pointed out a gap in the opposing force's patrol pattern. She suggested a flanking approach that would use the terrain to their advantage. She reminded him that the squad trusted him and that he just needed to commit to a decision. Briggs listened. He adjusted the plan based on Amara's input, and the squad executed it flawlessly. They reached the fortified position undetected, gathered the intelligence, and extracted clean. Their performance was graded as one of the best in the entire company. After the exercise, Briggs found Amara and shook her hand. He said, "I would not have made it through that without you. I froze, and you brought me back." Amara shook his hand and said, "You did the hard part. You made the call. I just pointed at the map." Graduation day came on a clear Saturday morning. The sun was bright, the sky was wide, and the field at Fort Whitmore was filled with recruits in their dress uniforms, standing in perfect formation for the last time. Families filled the bleachers. Officers stood on the platform. Flags waved in the breeze. Amara stood in her row, a uniform pressed, her boots polished, her back straight. She had no family in the bleachers. No one had come to watch her graduate. But she did not feel alone. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. The ceremony proceeded with speeches, awards, and recognitions. Names were called. Achievements were acknowledged. And then, near the end, the commanding officer announced a special recognition, an award for the recruit who had demonstrated the most outstanding leadership and tactical ability during the training cycle. It was the highest honor a recruit could receive at Fort Whitmore. The name called was Amara Nichols. The field erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from people who have watched someone earn something the hard way. Marshall was clapping with both hands above his head. Torres was grinning. Jackson was nodding with quiet pride. Even Briggs, standing in a different row, was clapping. Amara walked to the platform on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She climbed the steps. She stood in front of the commanding officer, who handed her the award and shook her hand. She turned to face the crowd, and for a moment, the world went quiet. She looked down at the award in her hands. Then she looked at her wrist, the hummingbird, the words, "You carry me." And then she looked up and saw, standing at the far edge of the field, away from the crowd, a tall figure in a dress uniform. General Harlan. He had not been scheduled to attend the graduation. He was not on the program, but he was there, standing alone, watching. Their eyes met across the distance. He did not wave. He did not smile, but he placed his hand over his left wrist, over the place where his own hummingbird lived, and held it there for a moment. Amara placed her hand over her own wrist, the same gesture, a mirror across the field, a silent conversation between two people connected by a woman who had loved them both. Then the general turned and walked away, slowly, quietly, without fanfare, just the way Miss Dot would have wanted it. Amara watched him go, and she smiled. Not a big smile, not a dramatic, tear-filled movie moment smile. Just a quiet one, the kind Miss Dot used to give when she was proud but did not want to make a fuss. Later that day, after the ceremony was over and the families had left and the barracks were being cleaned out for the next cycle of recruits, Amara packed her bag. She was leaving Fort Whitmore. She was being assigned to her first duty station. Her career, her real career, was about to begin. She packed Miss Dot's notebook last, tucking it carefully into the center of her bag where it would be protected. She ran her thumb over the worn cover one final time. Inside were the recipes, the prayers, the grocery lists, and the unfinished letter to David. Amara had thought about giving the letter to the general. She had thought about finishing it for Miss Dot, but in the end, she decided to leave it exactly as it was, unfinished. Because some things are not meant to be completed. Some things are meant to be carried. She walked out of the barracks for the last time and stopped at the door. She looked back at the empty room, the bunk where she had cried, the floor where she had done extra push-ups in the dark, the window she had stared through on nights when she thought she could not go on. Then she looked at her wrist one final time. "You carry me," she whispered back. "Always, Grandma, always." And she walked forward, into the sun, into the unknown, into the life that Miss Dot always knew she was strong enough to live. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, a hummingbird hovered near a fence post. Its wings were a blur of motion. Its tiny heart beat faster than any human heart could ever beat, and for just a moment it stayed perfectly still in midair, defying gravity, defying logic, defying everything that said something that small should not be able to fly. Then it darted forward and disappeared into the wide open sky.